Invincible Season 3 Episode 1 and 2 brought the differences between Mark and Cecil to a head. I'm going to make the argument for why Mark did nothing wrong in this encounter, and Cecil is not only in the wrong morally, but by his own utilitarian standards as well. Cecil had just deployed Darkwing 2, brainwashed into working for the GDA, and a bunch of combat cyborgs made by the still allowed to ply his trade, D.A. Sinclair. Before being brainwashed, Darkwing 2 was mentally unstable, punished petty crime with execution, and tried to unalive Mark for attempting to apprehend him. And Sinclair kidnapped random people and transformed them against their will into reanimen, mindless superhuman cyborgs. Upon learning that these men have not been punished for their actions, Mark is outraged and confronts Cecil, the man who deferred that punishment in order to utilize them. This confrontation escalates to violence. Mark is an emotional 19-year-old and bad at articulating his points, especially compared to Cecil. This is reinforced by the tendency of Invincible's writing not to distill characters into pure avatars of the ideas they represent. They talk like people in their time, place, and mental state realistically would. This is not inherently good or bad, it's a style of writing. Mark sounds like a hot-headed fool when he confronts Cecil. That said, his moral instinct on the issue and on the interaction is correct. The moral argument. I'm applying the non-aggression principle to this exchange, which states that the fault for violence is with the individual or group who initiated it, while retaliatory force against the initiator is acceptable. A credible threat of imminent violence, such as a gun being aimed at someone and which Cecil implies Mark to be in the confrontation by claiming to be afraid, counts as initiation. The initiation of force was done well before the confrontation when Cecil planted a sound bomb in Mark's head without his knowledge, a device which, when activated, subjects him to pain and debilitation. There was no reason to plant this device absent a willingness to use it against Mark, and Mark not knowing about it makes his consent impossible. This makes it a credible threat of violence, the aiming of a proverbial gun to his head. But even if we ignore that, since Mark confronted Cecil not knowing about the sound bomb, culpability for the violence still lies with Cecil, as is bringing out the reaniman in a room he stated was made to counter Mark, was also the aiming of a weapon that is deadly to Mark at him. Leading up to this, Mark was upset at Cecil and heatedly following him, but no reasonable person would consider this a threat. He started destroying reanimen before they attacked him, but these cyborgs are made from corpses and are automatons being commanded by Cecil. Destroying them in this situation is no different from destroying a pointed gun in Cecil's hand. And on the question of proportionality, the reanimen are deadly weapons to Mark, and Cecil knows this, or else he wouldn't have bothered using them in his White Room. We see them injuring him in episode 2 and killing one of his alt-dimension variants in episode 7. Cecil was the first party to bring violence into the equation by making this threat, and after the sound bomb was used, Mark fled the Pentagon and went to the Guardians for their help in removing it, whereupon Cecil teleported into the building and once again activated the sound bomb in order for his reaniman to capture Mark while he was debilitated by the noise. This was a first-degree, proactive, violent attack toward Mark in which any remaining tenuous claim of self-defense Cecil could make, a la the subjective fear for his own life, goes out the window. And to be extra clear, Cecil broadcasts his reason for doing this, which is that he couldn't let the Guardians get involved, quote unquote. It was not a concern that Mark had become hostile in a general sense, it was not concern for anybody's safety. Mark is powerful, one might argue. He could easily turn Cecil into a red mess in a brief lapse of self-control. Therefore, the standard for his non-hostility should be more stringent. Well, so could Immortal, so could probably Donald, and most of the supers, or Normie with a gun. The physical ease at which unaliving could be done makes it no less psychologically difficult. And on the same token, the physical ease by which Mark could unalive Cecil if he wanted is immaterial to his likelihood to actually do so, because it would require wanting to do so. Only a worldview that disregards moral constraint and subjects all things to power would view the mere existence of Mark's superpowers as an implicit threat. In one breath, Cecil advocates for redemption. In another, he criticizes Mark for being open to his father's redemption. Cecil's spoken justifications for his actions sound persuasive in the range of the moment, but on closer inspection are contradictory and designed to manipulate. The only position he stands by with consistency is the pragmatic necessity of his actions for the purpose of defending Earth. Nevertheless, let's take it further and judge the moral arguments he does make in isolation. He accuses Mark of being closed-minded and not open to any any other viewpoint. This argument could be used to justify anything in the face of any condemnation. Having a moral code necessitates the rejection of actions and viewpoints that run counter to it. Would it be better if Mark understood the thing he was rejecting and could articulate a better point against it? Yes, but that's better, not necessary. One need not taste sewage or know its entire composition to know that it's undesirable. He equates Mark with the villains he's utilizing by pointing out that Mark splattered Angstrom Levy. This is manipulation meant to prey on Mark's moral naivete, which he does possess, just not in his judgment of Cecil's actions. Angstrom Levy was trying to unalive him. Cecil also asserts that people, specifically his villains, deserve a chance at redemption. Where this argument fails is in the fact that the objects of his supposed redemption did not choose to fight on the side of humanity, they're being forced. D.A. Sinclair is not a free man if he quits, and Darkwing 2 was brainwashed to work for the GDA. Cecil cites Omni-Man as an example of Mark's inconsistency on the matter, as Mark doesn't treat his father with the same sanctimony as Cecil's slaves. Even if that claim were true, as an argument it fails on the same token. Omni-Man chose to abandon his mission of conquest, chose to accept guilt for his actions, chose to change, come what lethal consequences may. This is the proper path to redemption, not being indentured or brainwashed and conscripted to fight the enemies of your supposed betters. An action carries no moral weight in either direction if it's not a choice. If Earth fights a war for its freedom from alien rule with slaves, and if its prevailing code has become so corroded by cynicism that it defers punishment for the guilty in the name of defense, yet also preemptively punishes its greatest defender, then any adherence to a consistent code of values is annihilated. And as a civilization, Earth would be no better than Viltrum, and Cecil's only justification to fight would be a tribal in-group allegiance for his own species, which the Viltrumites can also claim for theirs. Mark, as a superhero, a defender of Earth from evil, was correct not to sanction or even tolerate it. The argument from consequence. The pragmatic layer of this topic must be addressed within the boundaries of the story's events and outcomes, and if it turns out that Cecil's immoral actions were a net contributor towards saving Earth that made an indispensable difference, then the concept of necessary evil for a greater good will be the value judgment asserted by the show, though as it stands, this is not the case. Steelman. Cecil's slaves and dirty methods were necessary to win. Mark would rather cling to his principles and let humanity be conquered or destroyed. Mark's integrity is what saved humanity from Omni-Man, where all of Cecil's tools and subterfuge failed. Not Mark's power, mind, Omni-Man was ragdolling him, but his unwillingness to bend on what to the best of his knowledge was right for the sake of comfort, convenience, or hypothetical necessity. If he accepted Cecil's worldview that noble hypothetical ends justify evil means, then he would have sided with Omni-Man. This only proves the unreliability of individual loyalty to consistently work toward the survival of humanity. Cecil being able to resort to compulsion compensates for this shortcoming. Contemptible though it might be, it is nonetheless necessary. When Cecil's coercion toward Mark was shown to the Guardians of the Globe, and the majority of them quit, it showed a lack of compatibility between his coercive methods and the voluntary dedication of the people who work for him. Coercion and voluntary dedication can only coexist if either the coercion is kept secret or the free participants conscious and have some kind of assurance that this coercive power will not be turned against them. The obstacles and inefficiencies of this arrangement are self-evident. There was no reason to think Omni-Man would turn traitor either, and Mark is his son. The contingencies against Mark are warranted given recent events. Mark was born on Earth and has no history prior to living there. You can reliably predict the actions of a sane person by looking at their past actions and present situation. If Omni-Man's history had been known, then his betrayal of Earth could have easily been predicted. The fight against Doc Seismic right before the confrontation was salvaged by Cecil's methods. The Guardians, Eve, and Mark might have been screwed without Darkwing 2 and the Reaniman. And one can notice in this scene that Cecil was hesitant to deploy Darkwing 2 and the Reaniman because he knew revealing them would generate controversy in the ranks. Beyond that, it was the fault of Cecil and the GDA that Doc Seismic escaped and reasserted himself as a threat to begin with. He was their prisoner. One can primarily blame the GDA's modus operandi of trying to utilize villains rather than permanently neutralizing them or their powers. Cecil's practice of using evil rings of power for good rather than destroying them made itself necessary in circular fashion. But that's only looking at a specific scenario. It does not refute the necessity of Cecil's methods in other possible scenarios, especially when the brainwashed villains and reanimate's efficacy in battle is beyond question. It could still mean the difference between victory and defeat. This is true. In the future, these assets acquired through immoral means could be necessary. But look at the entire picture of what Cecil is doing. Sacrificing justice, cohesion with his allies, and the security that comes from permanently neutralizing unrepentant villains for the sake of a could, a might, a maybe. Basing one's actions on what is feared to be true isn't any less impractical than basing them on what is hoped to be true in a wish upon a star. All magical thinking is the same, functioning independently of the truth with only the occasional chance overlap. Positing it cynically doesn't change its nature. But the drawbacks of Cecil's actions are the fault of allies and masses who don't want to accept the grim utility of these methods. Being disagreed with doesn't make you wrong. That argument is an appeal to the paradigm of right and wrong which Cecil has abandoned, not the amoral consequentialism he's embraced. His worldview must acquiesce to the hard realities of the world, and one of these realities is that the world is driven by people and their values, desires, and sentiments, not consistent engines of logic. This is why the played-straight superhero with integrity will inevitably come into conflict with their public and their government. They don't acquiesce to norms or consensuses, only to their moral code. They, not consequentialists like Cecil, are the ones truly free to act in spite of the will of the public, because they're the ones who operate based on right and wrong and don't require the approval or compliance of any master or mob. During the confrontation, Mark demanded that Cecil go public with his actions, and Cecil refused, despite the implication that it would placate Mark. To close out this segment, it was voluntary trust and moral restraint that saved both Mark and Cecil in their confrontation. Mark, because when he was debilitated by the sound bomb in his head and being taken by Cecil's reanimant, the Guardians, who had a bond of trust with him, voluntarily came to his defense. And after Robot disabled the sound bomb and Cecil was at the mercy of a now furious Mark, moral restraint was ultimately what protected Cecil from the thing he feared, after all of his preparation and countermeasures had failed. Psychoanalysis. Cecil was shown in his past to be very similar to Mark, willing to fight to the end against a stronger enemy and endure any torment for what he believed to be right. He also held that justice must not be deferred just because the villain is now useful to you, that the ends do not justify the means. His mind was changed when he was thrown into prison for killing two of the GDA's brainwashed villains, and he was forced to manipulate and mingle with violent criminals in order to stay alive. Radcliffe, the then director of the GDA, explained that his imprisonment was a test for Cecil to prove that he had what it took to succeed him, while affirming their modus operandi of fixing talent rather than destroying it. In that conversation, Radcliffe equated Cecil to the villains the GDA brainwashed, despite Cecil's so-called crime not being comparable, nor warranting the potentially lethal punishment he was given, likely without trial. The GDA doesn't just twist and mold villains to suit its purposes, it does so to heroes as well, Cecil having been one such hero who had submitted to the conditioning. The quote, "We can be the good guys, or we can save the world," is an argument from consequence that presupposes a future outcome. Its legitimacy is founded on logic within a tailored scenario where little logic or scenario can actually be presented. Yet Cecil, after forced conditioning, accepted it. And this is why he makes the arguments he does to Mark, equating him to villains and trying to convince him of the futility of clinging to inflexible morals. He views Mark as being in the position of his past self, with himself now in the role of Radcliffe, repeating the cycle. This is also why he tries to cow Mark into submission through manipulation and violence, just as Radcliffe did to him. When Cecil told Mark he was, quote, scaring the hell out of him in the White Room, he was telling the truth, because having abandoned his moral code, he now only gauges people's motivations through the lens of sharp power, violence, and manipulation. Whatever genuine compassion, human connection, and good intent he possesses must exist in the cracks between the moral structure, or to be precise, lack of one, which he has accepted. What he saw confronting him in the White Room was not an idealist who was repulsed by the idea of deleting another person, but only a powerful being who physically could end him and get away with it. Moral scruples, like the unwillingness to kill, are now tenuous conceits in Cecil's view, destined to inevitably be abandoned. While to Mark, morality is a puzzle he has not solved, but has not abandoned either. Closing. Cecil is not wrong because he's willing to do whatever is necessary to preserve human life. This facet of his character, in isolation, is noble. He's wrong because of his willingness to hold forecasts of the possible future as justification for moral violations whose harm is real and certain, brainwashing villains on the chance that power will be needed when the next disaster comes, while blanking out the fact that the superheroes and GDA agents who do the overwhelming majority of disaster control are motivated by a sense of common cause against which coercion in the ranks would naturally chafe, soundbombing Mark on the chance he would become murderous while blanking out Mark's entire history. A popular take is that Cecil keeping Conquest alive on the chance his knowledge will be needed to deal with the next Viltrumite attack was the dumbest decision he ever made. Yet it's actually completely on brand with his character, taking the tea leaves of hypothetical doomsday as an impetus for his actions, and obedience to their prophecy as a path to salvation. That is what it means to hold that the ends justify the means. Not the recognition of a practically necessary action, but the blanking out of the truth that is known in favor of a hypothesis of the future. An augury whose only claims to truth are the occasions in which its broken clock is correct by chance. Mark, meanwhile, is not right because of a stubborn adherence to inflexible commandments, nor his propensity to cling to emotions in the face of reason. These are flaws in his character, not virtues. He's right because he recognizes evil when he sees it and hasn't allowed pain, hardship, nor the endless rationalizations spewed at him by villain and anti-hero alike to force or fool him into believing that the evil he sees is actually something else and shouldn't be condemned. One of the great falsehoods yet living in the popular conscious is the notion that the moral and the practical are opposed. A particular moral code can be evil and destructive, but this doesn't make the lack of one good. And I believe that the irrational moral code propagated by the majority of superhero media in the past decades has contributed to the sentiment that an amoral consequentialist like Cecil can be in the right, since he circumvents this irrational moral code by discarding morality entirely. Morality is a code of universal right versus wrong, meant to inform our actions toward our own well-being beyond what the limited calculus from what we immediately see and know is able to predict by itself. Those who abandon it for short-term gain within that limited calculus act toward their own destruction. This can be observed in life and is concretized in the art of all cultures, time periods, and genres. Thank you for watching!